Welcome back to the deep dive. We're looking today at something pretty big that happened just a few days back, June 12th, 2025. Based on the material you shared, this was, well, it felt like the internet just broke for a lot of people.
Yeah, it was a major disruption.
Yeah,
And it all started deep inside Google Cloud.
exactly. And it's more than just, technical glitch story. It
Yeah.
feels like a real window into how these incredibly complex systems we rely on can fail.
And how information flows, or maybe doesn't flow, during a crisis.
Right. And what it tells us about the sort of hidden wiring of the internet. We've dug into a detailed report here looking at official statements, media coverage, and maybe most interestingly, the real-time stuff from the tech community itself.
Yeah, the folks on the ground, basically.
Mm.
And it's really important to understand, this wasn't just some minor blip. This took down major services, things you probably use every single day.
Hmm.
It exposed some really fundamental vulnerabilities in the digital infrastructure we all just assume works.
So our mission today in this deep dive is to figure out what actually happened.
Yeah, what happened, why it had such a huge impact, and crucially, what lessons we can take away from it, for building a more resilient digital future. Because we clearly need one.
Okay, let's unpack this then. So the initial tremor, it hit around 10:45 a.m. Pacific time, June 12th. And like I said, for many people, it just felt like things stopped working. That confusion, right? Is it just me?
That feeling was everywhere. And the trigger, according to the report, was actually quite subtle. An invalid automated quota update.
So not a hack, not like a server catching fire?
No, nothing like that. It was a logical error.
Hmm.
Basically, a policy change got pushed out, but it had unintended blank fields in it. A configuration mistake, essentially.
Blank fields in what kind of system?
It was a core API management service.
Yeah.
Google later called it an identity and access management service issue. The community, particularly on places like Hacker News, they were speculating it might be a service maybe called Chemist.
Okay, so like a gatekeeper system.
Exactly. Think of it like that. It enforces policies. Who gets to access what API? How often across huge parts of Google's infrastructure?
Yeah.
It's fundamental.
Right, so this gatekeeper gets bad data. What's the immediate effect?
It started rejecting tons of API requests.
Yeah.
Just blocked them. Because the policy data was messed up, it couldn't properly figure out authorization or, rate limit.
And its default was just, nope.
Basically, yeah. It threw back HTTP 503 errors mostly. Service unavailable.
Which to you, the user, just looks like your app is broken, Spotify won't load or whatever.
Exactly. But here's the really critical part. The reason it was so widespread, this API management, this identity layer, it's globally replicated.
Oh.
So that single bad config, those blank fields, they got pushed everywhere, all over the world within seconds.
Wow, so it wasn't a regional issue that spread, it was just global failure, instantly.
Pretty much. Because the flawed instruction propagated so efficiently, it's a really nasty failure mode for these huge global systems. A logical error that gets copied perfectly everywhere.
That's wild. And speaking of speed, it was kind of amazing how fast the tech community figured this out.
Oh, yeah.
Like on Hacker News, people were crowdsourcing it in real time. They basically nailed the cause, this core policy system, the bad update, way before Google officially confirmed the details.
That community intelligence really became the fastest source of truth for a lot of engineers trying to figure out what was going on. Google's first move, the report says, was to basically bypass that broken quota check.
Okay, turn off the broken part. Makes sense.
Yeah, but it had a knock-on effect.
Mm-hmm.
While it fixed things for most services globally, that sudden flood of requests that had been blocked then overwhelmed the underlying database that stores the quota policies, specifically in the Central 1 region.
So fixing the main problem created a secondary problem elsewhere.
Exactly. So
Okay.
Central 1 had issues for longer, even after the main global fix was rolled out. Just shows how interconnected everything is. Fixing one thing can stress another.
Okay, so a single bad config update in a core identity system triggers a global API failure. But the dominoes didn't stop falling there, right? It caused chaos inside Google's own systems, too.
Oh, absolutely. The blast radius within Google Cloud Platform itself was huge. I mean, the list is long. API Gateway, App Engine, BigQuery, Cloudflare Store, logging, monitoring, Cloud Run, Spanner, SQL, storage, GKE, Vertex AI.
Basically, huge chunks of GCP just became unusable.
Pretty much, yeah.
Oh.
Globally. And to make things worse for people trying to fix their stuff, even the Google Cloud Console itself was hit.
Oh, man. So you couldn't even log in easily to see what was broken.
Exactly. Made it incredibly difficult for admins to diagnose or manage their own infrastructure during the crisis.
And this is where it gets really, really interesting for me, because it wasn't just GCP customers feeling the pain. This completely shattered that idea that Google's consumer stuff, like Gmail, is totally separate from its cloud platform.
That's a critical point. Many of Google's biggest consumer services rely heavily on that same shared identity and API infrastructure. So when that core layer went down,
Boom! Gmail stops working. Google Drive won't sync.
precisely, we saw huge problems across Google Workspace, Gmail, Drive, Docs, Meet, Chat. Productivity just ground to a halt for millions.
Wow.
Nest devices, Google Home speakers, they couldn't connect. GPay had issues in India. Even RCS messaging on Android phones was impacted.
So for billions of people, this wasn't some abstract cloud outage. It was just Google being broken
Yeah.
in their everyday lives.
Exactly. It blurred the lines completely.
And that matters to you listening, because the big takeaway here is that separation between Google Cloud for businesses and Google services for consumers, it's largely a myth, or at least much thinner than we thought.
Right. If your company relies on Workspace for communication and GCP for infrastructure.
A single failure like this takes out both your servers and your team's ability to talk about it or fix it.
It's a massive concentration of risk that maybe wasn't fully appreciated before this.
And the ripples didn't stop at Google's borders, did they? It
Yeah.
went beyond Google, impacting tons of other services.
Yeah, a huge digital domino effect across the wider internet.
We saw some really big names get hit because they build on top of GCP.
For sure. Spotify, Discord, Snap, Shopify, major AI companies like OpenAI and Anthropic, developer platforms like Replit, Twitch, Character.ai, this list goes on.
All reporting major problems because their backend relies on GCP services.
Either running directly on GCP or using its APIs, yeah.
Well, let's zoom in on Cloudflare for a second, because they're often seen as like internet bedrock,
Right.
right? CDN, DNS, security. But they were a major victim here too.
They were, and
Yeah.
it was a really public demonstration of just how interconnected things are, even between companies you might think of as competitors.
So what was their specific dependency on Google?
The report highlights Cloudflare's Workers KV service. It's a key value store they use for configuration data, and it runs on Google Cloud infrastructure.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So when GCP's core IMPI system failed, Workers KV basically lost access to its data. It went offline.
And because Workers KV was down,
Yeah.
other Cloudflare services started failing.
Exactly. It cascaded within Cloudflare. Their access service for authentication, the Warp VPN client, their turnstile capped DCHA thing, even parts of their own dashboard. All were affected because they relied on Workers KV.
That must have surprised a lot of people that a core Cloudflare service depended on GCP like that.
It definitely raised eyebrows, yeah.
And the web gets even more tangled. Look at Supabase, which the report mentions. They're hosted on AWS, right? Amazon's cloud, not Google's.
Right. And that's such a perfect example of these hidden multi-hop dependencies.
So how did they get hit?
Okay, follow the chain. GCP has the outage that takes down Cloudflare's Workers KV because it runs on GCP. And then Supabase, running on AWS, has problems because it depends on Cloudflare for certain functions. Maybe authentication callbacks, maybe webhook processing, something like that.
Wow, so GCP fails, Cloudflare fails, Supabase on AWS fails.
Exactly. That one example just perfectly illustrates the complex, often invisible, dependencies across the modern internet. And that's critical for you to understand when you think about risk. Even if you think you're diversified across clouds, your critical services might be linked back to a single point of failure through these third-party vendors.
It's mind-bogglingly complex. Okay, so beyond the tech failures, the report you shared really hammers home that the handling of the outage, the communication, that was almost as damaging.
Yeah, that was a huge source of frustration, this whole all-green paradox people talked about.
Right. Google's official status page showing green check marks, no major incidents, for ages after things were clearly broken globally.
Which left customers totally in the dark, wasting time debugging their own systems, thinking it must be us.
Until that bombshell dropped, reportedly from a big customer on an emergency call shared on Hacker News, that the status page is updated manually.
Yeah, it changes everything, right? It's not real-time monitoring data you're seeing.
It's a corporate comms channel.
It's exactly. Manually curated, which means delays. Approvals needed from management, PR, legal, before they admit to a massive outage.
The incentive seems to be managing perception, managing liability, before telling customers what's actually happening.
It appeared that way. We even saw weird things like the Firebase status page initially acknowledging the GCP issue, then that specific link getting edited out later.
Yeah.
Very confusing signals.
And you compare that to Cloudflare's response. Google's was slow, kind of guarded. Remember that first post? suggesting people clear their browser cache.
Right. Whereas Cloudflare was much faster,
Right.
much more transparent.
Yeah, they updated their status page quickly, saying it was a third-party service that is a key dependency.
And their spokespeople actually named Google Cloud to the press pretty quickly. Which, okay, may be awkward for Google.
But invaluable for everyone else.
Absolutely. It let engineers everywhere stop chasing ghosts in their own systems and understand the upstream problem much faster.
So this whole thing really cemented the idea that you just shift. You can't rely only on vendor status pages during a big crisis.
Nope. The technical community, places like Hacker News, Reddit, they effectively became the real-time source of truth.
Because the vendor has this built-in conflict of interest, right? Managing perception, liability, maybe even wanting to delay the official start time of the outage for SLA
It
reasons.
just destroys trust and wastes engineers' time when every second counts.
So the takeaway for you listening, have your own monitoring, don't just trust the vendor's dashboard, and pay attention to what the broader tech community is saying during a crisis. It's often faster and more accurate.
Okay, so we've talked about what happened, how it was communicated. Let's dig deeper into why. Why was the system vulnerable like this? What systemic issues came to light?
The report mentioned something called the myth of globally replicated. What's that about?
It's a really key insight, that core IAM API system. It was designed for global availability. That replication was a feature for resilience. But in this specific failure mode, a logical error in the data, that replication became the mechanism for instant worldwide failure. The very thing designed for resilience became the pathway for collapse.
Because it copied the bad instruction everywhere efficiently.
Exactly. It highlights that logical flaws, if they get replicated, can be way more devastating than, say, a physical failure in one data center. As one analysis put it, a service designed to be globally replicated still failed because the logic it relied on was flawed.
And this whole event really put a spotlight on identity and access management IAM as being this new kind of choke point for the internet.
Oh, absolutely. It's foundational. It's not just another service. It's the layer that determines who you are and what you're allowed to touch across the entire cloud.
So if that breaks?
Everything breaks.
Yeah.
Authentication fails, authorization fails. It's not just a feature outage. It's like the digital supply chain snapping at its most critical link. It means making identity systems resilient has to be a top strategic priority for everyone.
Let's circle back to Cloudflare again. Their situation was like a masterclass in dependency risk, that critical reliance on GCP for workers KV.
Yeah, but maybe even more important was their response after. Their post-mortem didn't point fingers. They took full ownership.
Right. They said something like, we're ultimately responsible for the dependencies we choose.
Exactly. And they didn't just say it. They followed up with a concrete plan. Re-architect workers KV onto their own infrastructure to kill that specific dependency.
That's taking responsibility.
It really is. And it's a blueprint for everyone listening. Examine your dependencies, not just on your main cloud provider, but on all the other SaaS tools and platforms you use. What do they depend on?
Because this outage just blew up the simple idea of multi-cloud, didn't it? Just using AWS and Azure and GCP isn't enough if they secretly depend on each other.
Precisely. That super base example, AWS failing because of GCP via Cloudflare, makes that painfully clear.
So multi-cloud means a rethink.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It's not just about spreading workloads. It's about deep dependency mapping. You need to understand the chain. What cloud does your critical CRM vendor use? What cloud does their authentication provider use? It's supply chain risk management, but for your tech stack.
And the report also touched on other things, like automation being a double-edged sword.
Yeah, it pushed the bad change everywhere instantly.
And just the general fragility when so much of the internet relies on a tiny number of huge providers.
All valid points exposed by this. Now, what about the fallout for Google? This has got to hurt more than just a few hours of downtime.
Oh, for sure. There's the financial side, starting with SLAs, right? Service level agreements.
Yeah, and let's be real. The sources confirm standard SLAs give back pennies compared to the actual business losses companies face during an outage like this.
Tiny credits, often capped, and you have to jump through hoops to even claim them.
Exactly. The real cost for Google is the massive engineering effort to fix the immediate problem, analyze the root cause, and then invest heavily in preventing it from happening again. Plus, the future investment needed to rebuild trust.
And that trust. That's the big one, the reputational damage. Google's whole brand is built on SRE, site reliability engineering. They're supposed to be the best at running things at scale.
And this failure, caused by a bad automated change, it hits right at the heart of that narrative. It undermines their core claim to excellence.
The timing is rough too, isn't it? GCP is fighting hard against AWS and Azure.
Really rough. Trust is everything when you're trying to win big enterprise deals. This just gives competitors ammunition. And it doesn't help that it fits into a bit of a pattern, unfortunately, after other high-profile incidents like accidentally deleting a customer's environment in 2024.
Right, a pattern starts to look like instability, even if the causes are different.
Perception matters.
We saw market reactions too, like Cloudflare's stock taking a hit initially, and the long-term effect. Existing customers are definitely going to be rethinking things.
Reevaluating dependencies, accelerating multi-cloud plans.
And potential new customers. They now have this massive reliability question mark hanging over GCP.
It's an asymmetric cost for Google. As the challenger, they need to be seen as absolutely rock solid. An outage like this forces them onto the defensive, and that costs momentum.
Okay, so where does the industry go from here? This feels like it has to be a catalyst for some real changes.
I think it has to be. It definitely accelerates that multi-cloud imperative, but the redefined version we talked about.
Focused on resilience, deep dependency mapping.
Exactly. It's not optional anymore for serious businesses. And we'll probably see more demand for tools and platforms that help manage these complex multi-vendor setups intelligently.
And for developers, for engineers,
Right.
it's a clear mandate for resilient design patterns, right? People are already talking about building apps differently because of this.
Yeah, absolutely. The key technical takeaways seem to be architect for identity failure. Don't assume your authentication provider will always be there.
So things like caching credentials locally, having
Right.
fallback modes.
Precisely. Implement graceful degradation.
Mhm.
Your app shouldn't just fall over completely if one core dependency is unreachable. It should still function, even if in a limited way.
What about the bigger picture? Does something like this bring regulators knocking, government involvement?
It certainly ramps up the pressure. I mean, cloud isn't just for websites anymore. It runs healthcare, finance, government services.
Critical infrastructure.
It's exactly. So when it goes down hard like this, it's not just inconvenient. It's potentially a public safety or national security issue.
So you could see rules coming down the line.
It's definitely being discussed more seriously. The prediction is that events like this push us closer to classifying major cloud providers as critical infrastructure, which could mean mandated uptime, required transparency during incidents, maybe even greater legal liability for failures.
And this isn't the first massive cloud outage, is it? When you look back, AWS S3 in 2017, Azure AD in 2021, Fastly in 2021.
Right. You see these recurring themes pop up again and again. Single points of failure, automation risks, communication struggles.
So this Google outage, while huge, fits into a pattern. It's not an isolated freak event.
No, it reinforces that these are systemic challenges across the industry that demand a systemic response. These outages are painful, but they force learning.
So wrapping this deep dive up, what we saw with the Google Cloud outage in June 2025 was a single, seemingly small logical error in a core global system.
That cascaded into a massive, multi-layered disruption.
It exposed just how hidden and complex the dependencies across the internet really are.
And it really highlighted some major flaws in how incidents are communicated by vendors when the pressure is on.
The big lesson seems to be that resilience isn't just the cloud provider's problem anymore.
No, it's a shared responsibility. It runs all the way from the hyperscaler through the SaaS vendors you rely on, right down to how you architect your own systems and plan for failure.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the material you shared. It's been illuminating, if a bit scary.
It has. And maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on as you navigate your digital life today. If one bad line of config can bring some of the most sophisticated infrastructure on the planet and its biggest users to their knees, how well do you truly understand the hidden cascading dependencies in the digital services you count on every single day? Professionally, personally.
Yeah,
How deep does that rabbit hole go?
something to think about.